a super important topic, and it's something that a lot of people don't think about. And it's looking at American history from a regional perspective as opposed to a national perspective. So the goal of what we're going to do today is to think about American history from the perspective of really three different major geographical locations. Specifically, the area that we refer to as the North, the South, and the West. Now, you have to be able to differentiate between these different regions. First of all, you have to know what those regions entail. But in addition to that, you need to also be able to understand, what they believed in different eras. What separated them, and how did maybe the culture and the political views of each region kind of shape what was happening to America nationally. So this is a super important timeline that we're going to go through today, because this timeline is going to help you answer a number of different questions. It's going to explain a lot of political differences between Americans throughout the history that we have to know. It's also going to explain how different parts of America have developed over time. And lastly, it's going to help us understand some of the root causes of major events, such as the Civil War. So knowing this stuff is super important. So if you are taking notes and you want to follow along, because obviously everyone's doing this slightly different, the way that I'm going to timeline this is I'm actually creating three separate timelines for each of the different regions that we're going to be talking about today. So what I'm going to do is I've got our history here at the top: 1776, 1789, 1800, 1820, 1846. Those are going to be the first big chunks that I'm going to look through at the start of today's lesson. And then I'm going to finish it up, obviously, through the 1800s, 1846, 1860, and then 1900. And for each of these different time periods, I'm going to talk a little bit about, what were some of the characteristics of each of these regions, and how did those characteristics shape what they believe. Now, obviously, at different times, like these regions are going to be working together, and they're going to be in agreement. And other times, their different needs, their different characteristics are going to lead them into conflict. In order to kind of note the fact that there are a lot of obviously big events in each of these eras, I've also kind of put this last column right here, which is on key events. So as I go through each of these different regions, I'm going to talk a little bit about, in each time period, okay, here are some big events that you should know that will maybe help you understand what's going on during that era. Okay, so like I said, if you are following along, you could just take a notebook and just draw your timeline across, and then just kind of create three rows and label one north, one south, one west, and then if you want, key events here at the bottom. Okay, so let us get started right away so that we can get going on this. So just a reminder again, the dates on the sheet are, we're going to start in 1776. So we're going to start with our Revolutionary era, and then the second date is 1789. So that's the first time period that I'm going to be talking about. So it is important to note that there are geographical differences that come from even the colonial period. So before the colonial period, there was the 13 colonies, and there was the New England colonies, the middle colonies, the southern colonies. But after the American Revolution, which is why we're starting in 1776, the United States got more land. So we went from being these 13 colonies that were only along the East Coast to all of a sudden now expanding all the way out to the Mississippi River. And so there were new regions that emerged at the end of the Revolution, and those are the regions that we're going to be talking about: North, South, and West. So the first time period between 1776 and 1789, we're going to refer to as the era of the American Revolution. So I'm going to put American Revolution. It's also the period, if you want to talk a little bit about it, of the Articles of Confederation. Let me get a light on here. Sorry. There we go. That's a little bit better. So it's also leads us to the era of the Articles, or through the era of the Articles. Okay. Now, in this time period, which is sometimes referred to also as, it's the Revolutionary period, but it's also the critical period, we want to know a little bit about what defined each of these regions. So let's start with the North. The North's characteristics were defined from almost the same characteristics that go back to the colonial period. So during the Revolutionary period, what defined the North was it had an economy that was primarily based on trading. Okay, so its main economy was in trade. So there was a lot of good ports in the North. Like there was a lot of sailing ships, and so like a lot of what the North did even before this time period was they traded goods, and they continue to do that even after the Revolution is over. Now, another thing that kind of defines the North after the American Revolution ends. Is one of the things that kind of distinguished the North from some of these other regions was that they began to, because they were a trading economy, not have as great of a need for slavery. And so in the aftermath of the American Revolution, the North is going to outlaw slavery. And that is important because that distinguishes it from the South, which we'll see in a minute. Now, let's kind of talk a little bit about the South right now. The South, which had much more fertile land, there was more of it. It had a warmer climate. Because of those things, the South remained largely agricultural. After the after the American Revolution was over. And they were more likely to plant cash crops. In this time period, the main cash crop would have been tobacco. We're not to cotton yet. This is tobacco, and that would have been grown in Maryland and Virginia. You would have seen rice and sugar, like some sugar plantations, and not much. But rice and indigo in South Carolina. And it's because they're more agricultural that in the aftermath of the American Revolution, they never abolished slavery. So they're going to maintain slavery as part of their economy. Okay. The West is, for the most part, at this time period, just pure wilderness. Okay. And so it's defined by the fact that the West at this point, and when I say West, we kind of want to define what the West was. The West for Americans in this era from 1776 to 1789 was essentially where we live right now. Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, these were the western frontier. Even like Tennessee and Kentucky was considered to be the wilderness. It was unsettled. If you remember, going back to the period right before the American Revolution, the British had prevented Americans from actually going into these territories. And that was because of the proclamation of 1763. So now all of a sudden this land is being opened up after the revolution is over, and it's for the most part unsettled. Now, the government under the Articles of Confederation after the American Revolution begin to organize this territory, and we start to see the earliest examples of that with the Northwest Ordinance. Now, the Northwest Ordinance is one of the earliest attempts to kind of, I guess, organize the West for future statehood. And in that Northwest Ordinance, slavery is banned, and they also make room for like public education. So education becomes an important part of the history of the West. But for the most part, this area is not really well developed. Okay, so that's going to be our first time period, and this is going to kind of set the stage. And there are some themes that we need to talk about that are emerging immediately. The fact that the North is more commercial from the get-go, the South is more agricultural, and the West is more kind of the rugged frontier. Those are going to be themes that we're going to see continue throughout this time period, and it's a good way of thinking about these different regions. So let's get to our next era, which is the period of 1789 to 1800. All right, and this is the early constitutional period. So I'll just put early constitutional period or era because I'm running out of space. Early constitutional era. So this is the era like right after the Constitution has been established. You know, we're in this era trying to figure out what the Constitution means, but it also means that we're going to be starting to see the beginnings of political parties. And so like the regional identities of these different areas are going to help shape different political parties. So for example, in the North, they're going to continue to be trading, but they're also going to be, and I failed to mention this in the earlier box, they tend to be traders. relied on trading, and their economy is also based off of, for those that aren't trading, there tend to be small farmers. Okay, so that's their economic system. And so because they tend to be more commercial, where maybe the other regions of the country aren't, they favor what we call a stronger central government. Places like New York, places like Boston, they tend to want a stronger central government because they believe that a stronger central government, like the Constitution, would be able to regulate trade and, of course, help stimulate the economy, which obviously they were worried about and was a major problem under the Articles of Confederation. And so because they tended to want a stronger central government, it shouldn't be a surprise that in the North, they tended to favor the Federalist Party. Okay, they tended to be more likely to be Federalists. Alexander Hamilton, he came from New York, and so like same with John Adams, who was the first Federalist president. He came from Massachusetts, and so like the Federalists tended to be more popular in the North, where they wanted more powerful government to be able to regulate trade. Now the South, they were not primarily a trading economy. Like we talked about, they tended to be agricultural, and that continued even after the Articles of Confederation were no longer our government. Now, the thing about an agricultural economic system is that agricultural places tend to be a little bit more independent. And so because they're primarily farmers, they don't really feel like they need big government. In fact, actually, they're maybe a little wary of big government. I'm going to zoom in on this here. They're wary of big government because they feel like big government could maybe take away their rights. And so in the South, they tended to be more independent, and they tended to be more in favor of a weaker central government and what we call states' rights. Okay, so it is not maybe a shocker then that most of the support for the Democratic Republicans, which was the party of Jefferson, came from the South. Because they tended to be more, like I said, like of a mind that we don't need a strong central government. Now, the West is still largely wilderness at this time period. Okay, in fact, a lot of these areas aren't even states yet. They're territories. Like there's the Indiana Territory and the Ohio Territory, and so like they're not necessarily like concerned as so much about state versus federal. What they want to do is they just want government support and protection from Native Americans. They want a better transportation, and those become some of the goals of the West. And they tend to remain like, for those who do have jobs, they tend to be more agricultural. Okay. So these are some of the differences between these different regions that are emerging. Now, in this time period, some key events that show these regional differences would be things like Hamilton's financial plan, for example. I just forgot to switch there. So Hamilton's financial plan demonstrates these differences between the South and the North especially. Hamilton coming from like the North and obviously getting more support from Northerners for his financial plan, which included a national bank. It included excise taxes on whiskey. His financial plan was incredibly unpopular with farmers who were out West, who were taking excess corn and turning it into whiskey. So that would have been unpopular with the West and South, but more popular with the North. Other things that showed major, like I guess, differences between these regions would be things like the Alien and Sedition Act. And in the Alien and Sedition Act, it was passed as by Federalist John Adams, and it represented a stronger central government. And so the South especially was suspicious of this, as well as the West. So if you think about the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which is also something important to note, These are resolutions that are saying that states should have the right to nullify laws, and they're coming from a southern state in Virginia and a western state in Kentucky. Okay, and so you can see, like even in this time period, these regional differences are helping define our political system. Now that takes us into our next era, and our next era is the era of westward expansion and the market revolution. So I'm going to write that down. So I'll zoom in here. Westward expansion and the market revolution. Okay, so this is a really important era in the development of the United States, and it's also an important era in terms of like these regional differences that exist between these areas of the country. Because during the era of westward expansion and the market revolution, every one of these these regions are going to start to link up and to a greater extent than they had before. But the problem is as they link up, they also begin to specialize in different things. And so that creates a feeling of unity, of nationalism, but it also can lead to growing divisions that are going to continue as we get closer and closer to the Civil War. So let's talk a little bit about the North. So in the market revolution, the North is still a trading economy, but it's starting to switch over to like the earliest forms of industry. So a trading economy is kind of giving way to the beginnings of industry. And the industry that is primarily being built up in the North during this time period would be things like the Lowell mills. That's a good example. And so that's located in Massachusetts. Now, so the North is becoming more agricultural. Industrial. Because they're becoming more industrial, because they're still not only seeing the beginnings of factories during this time period, but they're also still trading a lot of goods. They really want the central government to come in and regulate trade and to protect these early factories. So they want the government to regulate trade. Okay, and so they're really calling for the government to protect their businesses, and we see like some major conflicts in the North during this time period because they're going to be heavily opposed to like the Embargo Act, which cut them off from trade with Europe. They're going to be heavily opposed to the War of 1812, which did exactly the same thing. And then as time goes on, after the War of 1812, they're going to want the government to protect this industry even more. And so they're going to favor things like the American system that is proposed by Henry Clay, as well as tariffs. So they're going to favor the American system, which will establish as a second national bank. They're going to favor, like a bit more roads for trade. They're going to especially want protective tariffs that protect the industries that are starting to emerge in, say, New England during this time period. Now, the South is very much different. Because they're agricultural, and they still are agricultural during this time period, they have different needs, okay? And especially they become even increasingly more reliant on cash crops because it's during this time period that we see Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin leading to the growth of king cotton. And so some of those other cash crops that had existed before, like tobacco, are increasingly becoming replaced by cotton as the main source of income for a lot of farmers in the South, especially wealthy farmers. And so they want to protect king cotton, and they also want to protect some of the labor systems that have developed around king cotton. So as cotton grew in the South, so do we see an increase in slavery. So these other regions of the country don't really have slavery at this time period, but in the South we see slavery increasing, and the Southerners starting to see themselves economically as reliant on slavery. That's a really, really big deal because that's going to create a major separation. This desire to protect slavery and also the fact that they're agricultural and see themselves as independent is going to only further their feelings of states' rights. See themselves as independents, and they're going to be very much opposed to tariffs. Now, the reason why they're so opposed to tariffs, and this is going to become a major issue as we move forward, is that Southerners, and this we're going to see this especially when we get into the next period, they don't really manufacture a lot of goods, so they have to import the manufactured goods that they need or get them from the trade from the North, and so they kind of don't like the fact that the North is, they're becoming reliant on the North, and they don't like anything that would make the goods that they need to import from Europe more expensive. Okay, so that takes us to the West. So what is the West like during this time period? In this era, the West is still agricultural, but they start to kind of take a new role in our new national economy that's developing during this time period. So even though they're agricultural, they're producing something different from the South. So the Deep South is relying on, King Cotton, but in the West, they become the leading food producers for the country. So corn, wheat, these are going to be grown primarily in the West, and the West is going to become the breadbasket, the food providers for the entire country. And we see this with the creation of new commercial technology that helps farmers, John Deere's steel plow or McCormick's mechanical reaper. Those things are going to allow the West to produce even more food, surpluses, if you will, to send to the South and to send to the North. Now, the most important issue for Westerners who are out there, besides obviously they are concerned about protection against Native Americans, that's going to be a major issue. But the other major issue that they have is that they want more internal improvements. They want to see better transportation that may allow them to get their goods to market and make it easier for them to move around the country from the North to the West and so on. So they're advocating for roads, canals, and other things that could connect them, especially to the North. So they want internal improvements. Roads, canals, and eventually railroads. Okay, big advocates for better transportation. And so you can see probably at this time period as this is really still the era of the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans during this time period, and we're going to see divisions emerge between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists that deal with these issues. So, for example, obviously a big issue is, and is going to be a major issue throughout this time period, is the power of the central government. And so one of the things that divides Federalists and Democratic Republicans in this era would be things like Marbury v. Madison, which was the Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court declared that it has the power of judicial review. That's in 1803. And that would have been controversial because, like Southerners, especially Thomas Jefferson, who was president at the time period, didn't want to see the Supreme Court, or the central government for that matter, have greater power. Another thing that, as I already said, heavily divided Americans during this time period was things like the Embargo Act. And the Embargo Act was hated in the North because it cut them the North off from trade, which meant that it cut off the Northerners from the way they supported themselves. Going along with the Embargo Act was the War of 1812, which was hated for the exact same reason. All of a sudden now their greatest trading partner, which was Great Britain, they no longer had access to, to do business with. And so that was a major concern. By 1820, kind of the thing that ends this time period is we start to see slavery emerging as a major issue between especially the North and South, but also relating to states that are developing in the West. We know like the Northwest Ordinance of this time period had, for the most part, banned slavery in places like Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, but like Western states or Western territory in the South, places like, say, Mississippi and Arkansas and Missouri were also areas where we started to see slavery spread. And so there's this debate over whether or not, where slavery should be allowed, where it shouldn't be allowed, the balance of free states to slave states in the Union. And this leads to one of the biggest controversies early on between the different regions of the United States, which is the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise dealt with whether or not Missouri should enter into the Union as a free state or a slave state. And ultimately, Henry Clay brokered a compromise in which they drew a line across the United States at the 3630 parallel. Anything north of that would be a free state moving forward. Anything south of that would be a slave state. Okay, and so this represents even growing sectionalism that we're going to continue to see in this next era. So let me zoom out here. So this next era is where we really start to see sectionalism take hold in the United States. So from between 1820 and 1846, we see a major growth in sectionalism. Now before this time period, there was, this era before was probably more nationalistic than sectionalistic. What I mean by that is, despite these clear differences between the regions, they were working together to create a national economy. And there were growing feelings of nationalism during this time period, especially after the the United States wins after the War of 1812. Okay? But those nationalistic feelings in this time period are going to give way to sectionalism between 1820 and 1846. So we're going to start to see nationalism give way to each of these regions caring more about their own interests. That's what sectionalism is. So let's talk a little bit about how that happened, what it looked like. So in this time period between 1820 and 1846, we see a new split between the political parties. And that split, while these are both national parties, that split does have, the different parties kind of favor different regions, if you will. So in the North, we see a number of things that kind of define this time period. They're still industrial, so let's just kind of move this over. So this beginning of industry is still going to be happening after 1820. The North is continuing to be a major textile industry for the United States. That's still a major part of what the North is going to do. Now, because they tend to be more industrial than the other regions of the country, they are going to favor the policies of the Whigs, which is going to emerge as a new political party after the election of 1828. If you remember, the Whigs are kind of more built around the ideas of Henry Clay. And Henry Clay, even though he's from Kentucky, he tended to be pro-business. And so he favored a national bank, he favored protective tariffs, he favored internal improvements. And so Henry Clay and the Whigs gained a lot of support in the North. The Whigs, in many ways, are very similar to the old Federalist Party, which was popular earlier in the North. Okay, because they represent a lot of the same issues. And obviously, a lot of those issues are tailored to what the people in the North do. We also see some other things that are defining the North during this time period. So one of those things is that in this era between 1920 and 1846, we start to see a growing abolitionist movement, which is going to help define the North. So in 1820, around that time period, you've got the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening is going to make a lot of people kind of rethink the issue of slavery. And so slavery becomes more of a moral issue than just an economic issue. And out of that, there's an abolitionist movement that starts to see slavery as wrong, as a sin, and want to abolish it completely. William Lloyd Garrison, for example, is in the North. And so this is going to be a defining characteristic that is going to create tension between, say, the North and the South over like the issue of slavery. The other thing that obviously just defines the North during this time period is that because they tend to be the areas where there's the most industry, we also see a large number of immigrants coming into this area. These are the old immigrants that we've talked about in this class. And especially Irish Catholics are going to move into cities in the North. Okay, and so these are some of the things that define the North during this time period. The South is going to be very different. Okay, the South is going to be continue to rely on King Cotton. King Cotton is still the #1 way in which the South basically provides for itself. And King Cotton is a huge moneymaker for not only the South, but the United States as a whole. Because of King Cotton, the South is going to continue to, obviously feel that slavery is an important part of their economy. So they're going to continue to rely on slavery. And slavery will continue to grow even into this era after between 1820 and 1846. We also see some distinct cultural differences between the North and the South during this time period. So the North is becoming a more diverse area as old immigrants come into the North and settle in those regions. Because this area has already got a lot of cheap labor in the form of slavery, almost no immigrants settle in the South. There's relatively little immigration at all. And so we start to see in the South the development of what we call a Southern Code of Chivalry, which was a code of honor that became adopted in the South. We also see Southerners start to kind of rethink the institution of slavery. So rather than as the North becomes more abolitionist and starts to see slavery as morally wrong, the South starts to see it as a positive good. John C. Calhoun from South Carolina actually, calls slavery a positive good. And then you have a continued fight in the South for states' rights. This idea that the power of the state is more important than the power of the federal government. And the South really does believe that if they want to nullify laws, they have the right to do that. Now, in the West is still largely agricultural. They're still going to be the food producers for the United States. They're going to see also a large number of immigrants coming as well. So old immigrants are going to settle in the West, making it a place of opportunity for a diverse group of people. And the old immigrants that are going to settle primarily in the West are going to be German immigrants that are coming during this time period. Okay, and so the country is continuing to be divided, and it's like there's a certain number of issues that we can see especially are causing tension between the different regions. So especially the issue of slavery, which we can see almost in a collision course between the North and the South. We see issues over like tariffs, for example, states' rights. These are going to be real sticking points, especially between the North and the South. During this time period, probably the best examples of that would be some major issues like the Tariff of 1828, which is referred to sometimes as the Tariff of Abominations. And the Tariff of Abominations is important because it leads to the nullification crisis, in which you've got South Carolina threatening to nullify the tariff, even potentially secede And it's a kind of a show of states' rights during the time period. You also have another example of tension, this time between the West and the North. And one of the things that the West hated was the West wanted access to cheap land. And they were very suspicious of banks. And this really stemmed from financial panics that had happened, in which they blamed banks for it. And so Jackson, who was president in the early 1830s, he really is going to hate banks, and we're going to see him take on the National Bank, which was liked by the North. It was liked by the Whigs. It was liked by like a lot of people who wanted more of a commercial economy. For Jackson and for a lot of Westerners, it was an elitist organization. And so the West kind of, along with the South, who sees the bank as too powerful of an institution for the central government, want that bank vetoed. And Jackson does do that. He vetoes the bank in 1832. Much to the chagrin of the Whigs. Okay, so once again, these issues are mounting, and it's important because it tells the story of that we're getting closer and closer to with the Civil War. Now, that takes us to our next era, which is Manifest Destiny, and I'm actually going to switch over so I have more room to my next sheet. So I'm going to make the switch here. Let me just kind of quickly. There's where we're at so far. So you got our North, our South, our West, and you can see where there's clear areas that favor different political parties. You've got also areas that favor trade and industry, agricultural and slavery, and specifically cotton as time goes on. Obviously access to better transportation, concern for banks, desire for more land. Like every different one of these regions has their own needs, and we're going to see that obviously help define each of these regions as we get closer and closer to the Civil War. So I'm going to just switch over here now so that I have more room. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the direct build-up to the Civil War. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how these regions developed after the Civil War distinctly. So this era before the Civil War, I'm going to refer to it as the era of Manifest Destiny. And also the debates over the expansion of slavery. Or I'll just put conflict over slavery. Because slavery is the driving issue that is kind of creating a wedge between these different regions at this time period. So our first date, for those that forgot to say it before, is going to be 1846 to 1860. This is this period before the Civil War, and we're going to kind of look at this between the North, the South, and the West, and then talk about key events the same way that we have already. All right, so let's start off with the North. What defines the North? Well, the North is still it's still different from the South, distinctly different from the South, in the sense that it is still a more industrial economy, and because it's more of an industrial economy. Now, remember that industry is textiles at this time period. It's also going to have more railroads. It's going to have more infrastructure. So when we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about canals, roads, railroad lines. There's more cities in the North. It has a higher population. Because of those things, obviously there's more infrastructure in the North than there is in the South, which tends to be more rural. In addition to that, we also see new groups starting to emerge in the North. And so we still have a strong abolitionist movement in the North prior to the Civil War. And it's only going to grow. So active in the North is still going to be people like William Lloyd Garrison, but we also see Frederick Douglass becoming a vocal, an important voice after 1847. They're also going to see in the North a strong, what we call, free soil movement in this time period. And the free soil movement is super important because the free soil movement was a way of thinking for a lot of Northerners that wasn't about abolishing slavery necessarily in the South, but they were concerned about the growth of slavery in the West. So as America acquired territory after 1846, there was concerns about whether or not that territory would be free or whether it would be slave. And there was an increasing number of Northerners who kind of took a free soil kind of stance on this issue. So they weren't willing to go as far as abolish slavery completely in the South. That was the abolitionist movement, which was more radical. The Free Soilers were about just preventing slavery from spreading to the West. We see a number of different Free Soilers during this time period. Abraham Lincoln was a Free Soiler. So was the Republican Party prior to the Civil War. All right, now, the Southerners still saw that as a threat, but it was an important movement that was happening during this time period. And, of course, also, because they're an industrial economy, they're going to still be pro-industry. So they're still going to be in favor of tariffs. They're still going to be in favor of more regulation of trade. They still want a stronger central government that can help regulate trade as well. So that's all happening in the North. Now, the South is becoming increasingly determined to protect slavery during this time period. And so for the South, they're going to continue to advocate for King Cotton and their agricultural economy. They are going to advocate also for states' rights, because as the North becomes more populated, and they fear that they're losing power to the North. And so states' rights is part of the argument that the South is making in order to protect their way of life, which at this time period obviously also includes slavery, which by this time period they see as a positive good. Now, not only do they want to protect slavery that they have, but the South begins to advocate for the expansion of slavery. Now, one of the things that cotton does is cotton destroys the soil where it's at. And so for a lot of Southerners, the only way to maintain slavery is to make sure that it's growing. And so we start to see Southerners become highly invested in manifest destiny. In fact, not only are they invested in manifest destiny, not only are Southerners pushing for the Mexican-American War and the annexation of Texas, because those are areas that they think they can expand slavery into, but they also are going to become interested in what we call Southern manifest destiny. And Southern manifest destiny is about expanding land to the South, where they know that slavery will be allowed to grow to. Because as long as it's below the Missouri Compromise line, slavery is allowed. And so there were a lot of Southerners who, during the Mexican-American War, wanted to see America take over all of Mexico so that they could add more territory south of the Missouri Compromise line and continue to expand slavery. So this is unrestricted manifest destiny in the South, and they definitely wanted to see slavery continue to expand without any kind of limits. And these are the issues that they cared the most about. Now, for Westerners were more likely to be free soilers. Which is why, if you look, the West did not go with the South during the Civil War. And the reason why Westerners tended to be free soilers were there were a lot of immigrants, there were a lot of Americans who'd gone out West in order to try to find a better life, like economic prosperity. During this time period, we've got the California gold rush that are driving people to California. And you've got a lot of people heading to California and Oregon in search of new economic opportunities. Well, there is a lot of Westerners who are going out there that do not want slavery in the territories, not because they're abolitionists, but because they don't want to compete with slave labor. They don't feel like they'll be able to support themselves. and they won't be able to have a job. And so a lot of Westerners did not want slavery in the territories, and we see that with, like, for example, the admission of California into the United States as a free state as part of the Compromise of 1850. So what are the major events that we need to know during this time period? And then we'll get into our last era that I'm going to talk about. During this time period, at the beginning, you've got the Mexican-American War. And the Mexican-American War, but for a lot of historians, is kind of viewed as really the beginning of the end and the build up to the Civil War. Because once we get that territory, that debate over whether or not slavery will be in California or whether it'll be in New Mexico or Utah or all these other places that we now have, is one of the driving forces for the Civil War. There's the Wilmot Proviso. The Wilmot Proviso is proposed by David Wilmot at the middle of the Mexican-American War, and basically it is a free soil doctrine which argues that any territory that we gain from Mexico should automatically be free. There should not be slavery allowed in those regions. We see debates between especially the North and South over, like, for example, the admission of new states like California, and that is in the form of the Compromise of 1850. Going along with that, there's huge debates over like the morality of slavery, which continue in the form of, like, the fugitive slave law, and whether or not Northerners should be forced to return slaves to the South, which they didn't want to do. So we see Northerners passing laws of their own, which like protects them from returning slaves. You also have the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is also about slavery expanding into new territories, leads to Bleeding Kansas, and obviously a whole host of conflict. You've got the birth of the Republican Party, which begins more support in the North, and then you even got the Dred Scott decision, which was a Southern decision. It was something that favored the South, and if you remember, Dred Scott was not only considered property, but it also basically said that because slaves were considered property, not only did they not have a right to sue in court, but the federal government could not prevent slavery in any territory. So these are the things that kind of lead us into the Civil War. And you can see, if I zoom out here, okay, these tensions are building and building and building until we hit that breaking point with the election of Lincoln. In fact, these tensions are so bad that essentially national parties cease to exist in the 1850s leading up to the Civil War. The North becomes essentially completely behind the Republican Party, and Lincoln wins with only support from the North. In the South, you've got mainly support for the Democratic Party, and they support John Breckinridge, is it John Breckinridge, I believe, as the Southern Democratic candidate. And then in the West, you also have more support for Lincoln because of their kind of free soil stance. And so when Lincoln wins the election in 1860, the South, feeling like their interest, their region is no longer even being considered, decide to exit. Now, between 1860 and 1865, we got the Civil War. And this is going to kind of dramatically change and resolve a lot of the issues that we've been talking about. So the Civil War is important because it finally resolves the slavery issue. Slavery is abolished with the 13th Amendment. And so that no longer becomes a major point of division between the North, the South, and the West. Another issue that is resolved is this issue of states' rights. Can a state break away from the Union? Is that something that they can do? Well, the Civil War kind of puts that argument to rest and says, like, the federal government is more powerful than the state government. And so that's also no longer an issue. But the economic differences between the North and the South are going to persist because these different areas have developed in many different ways as a result of their history. So let's talk about the last era that I want to go through, which is really up to around 1900. And we still see really some dramatic differences. We could actually even trace this all the way to more like 1920 or so. But either way, 1900, 1920, before there is really mass media that's bringing and linking up these regions together in new ways. Let's stick with 1900. And the reason I'm going to stick with 1900 is because that takes us to the closing of the West, which is going to be an important topic that I want to talk about. So what is the North like between 1865 and 1900? And you have to understand, this is the emergence of the industrial North, where we're starting to see the North go from like textiles and like the beginnings of industry during the market revolution to becoming about heavy industry. And when we say heavy industry, I'm saying this is the emergence of, let me zoom in here. This is the emergence of, well, I'll put this as post-Civil War. Sorry. All right, so this is the emergence of oil, steel, railroads as the drivers of the economy, okay? And this is also the era of big business. So just like in previous time periods, the North is going to be for big business, and they want the government to come in and protect those businesses. So the North is still going to be for protective tariffs. They want regulation of trade, but they don't want regulation of industry, and that's really important to understand. So even though they want like help in some areas, like railroads want land grants, the big businesses want protective tariffs. At the same time, they also want to be left alone when it comes to like the growth of monopolies or like how safe their factories are. So the North it wants help from the central government in some ways, but in other ways it wants like a laissez-faire. It wants to be left alone. And we also see in the North urbanization happening as more and more people leave those small farms and move into cities. We're starting to see the North as a very heavily populated area. We're starting to see cities emerge that look closer to cities like we think of today. So we talk about like streetcar cities that are spread out much further, factories there and ethnic neighborhoods, and people are living in dumbbell tenements. That's happening primarily in the North. That's not happening in the West. It's not happening in the South. We talk about those things. This is the region that we really want to kind of think about and refer to. And then also one of the things that define the North in this era is a growing diversity. So a lot of the new immigration that is taking place, it is like those new immigrants are coming and they're settling in the North. And they're settling in New York City. They're settling in Chicago. So like, just be aware of that. Now, the South, what is happening with them? So this is the Reconstruction era in the South, and we see Reconstruction in the South, and that's going to give way to the New South. So at the end of the Civil War, the North is going to come in, and they're going to try to rebuild the South, and they try to make the South closer to what the North was at this time period. And so they actually begin to industrialize the South. So the South goes through a period of industrialization, but they're not producing the heavy industry that the North is. Instead, we see the beginnings of the rise of like a textile industry in the South. So we got more industrialization happening in the South than ever before. But whereas the North used to be the textile producers in America, now the South is becoming the textile producers. A majority of Southerners, despite this textile industry, are still agricultural, and we start to see a large number of people engaging in sharecropping. Slavery no longer exists, and so there is no slavery as a major labor system, and so a lot of former slaves end up taking sharecropping positions and working for like former plantation owners in a form of labor that leads to a cycle of poverty. Sharecropping, which helps like define a lot of what people did, and this wasn't just African Americans. There were whites and blacks who were involved in sharecropping. But those who did do sharecropping oftentimes were trapped in a cycle of poverty. Now, in addition to like the sharecropping, in the South, we also see a growth of Jim Crow laws. So at the beginning of this time period, Reconstruction had granted African Americans more rights, but over time, as like Southern Democrats come into power, we start to see the birth of Jim Crow, which are going to establish strict laws involving segregation. And we really start to see two separate societies emerging in the South, in which case everything seems to be divided along color lines. And then there's attempts by a lot of hate groups, especially like the KKK, in order to try to keep African Americans from exercising their rights. And so this becomes kind of one of the defining features of the New South. In the West, they have some very specific things happening for them as well. Now, we call this time period the period of the Last West. And it's called the Last West because it's during this time period that the West is starting to close. The frontier is no longer completely open. So before the Civil War, there was always uncharted land to be settled. But in the years during the Civil War and immediately after, we're starting to see like all parts of the West settled. So for example, during the Civil War, the United States passed the Homestead Act. And so there is a large number of Americans who go out west to become farmers along the Great Plains, and they do this hoping for a better life. Now, it is a hard life. Like life on the Great Plains is difficult. You get 160 acres of land from the government. It was relatively free, but even those 160-acre lands didn't yield a lot of food. And so for a lot of people who went out west to be like a small farmer, like a homesteader, their life was very, very difficult. We start to see more and more people take advantage of this as well as other frontiers out west because of improved transportation during this time period. So it's during this time period we see the Transcontinental Railroad. And the Transcontinental Railroad is going to bring people out west more easily, which is going to lead to even further settlement. Not only are there going to be more farmers going out west, but you see people going out west to take advantage of like search for gold and the mining frontier. You've also got cattle ranchers that are moving out west to grow like livestock and beef. So all of these things are happening out west. So it's largely an agricultural area, but it's there's different types of agriculture that are taking place. Over time, this agriculture is going to become more commercial. So a lot of these smaller farmers, like the homesteaders, are going to give way to massive farms that are raising like huge herds of cattle or growing thousands of acres of land and utilize new technology like combine harvesters in order to maximize their profits. What a lot of farmers find is that they're facing a number of challenges in the West. So one of the challenges comes in the form of conflicts out there that we don't see in the South and we don't see in the North. That involves conflicts with Native Americans for control of land. And these conflicts with Native Americans is going to lead the United States government to force Native Americans onto reservations and then eventually try to assimilate them. And then we're also going to see farmers during this time period clash with big business. Especially the railroads. So whereas the North tends to be in favor of big business and wants like laissez-faire, and big businesses want the government to leave them alone, in the West you see an increasing call for more regulation of big business. So it's during this time period that we see, especially in the West, the growth of, for example, the National Grange movement, which gives way to farm alliances. And then eventually, and this is super important to know, the Populist Party. And what they're doing is they're advocating for farmers out west who feel like they're being taken advantage of by these big businesses that are out east. So even though the Civil War is over, we still see conflicts between, say, rural America and more industrial America. The economy is still driving, obviously, some of these major conflicts. It's also obviously there's things that are being driven by like rights and who has access to freedoms in the post-Civil War era. And obviously there's still conflicts over race. Just because the Civil War ends slavery doesn't mean that all of a sudden now there is full equality, which we can see with the like some of the things that are happening in the New South, especially the rise of those Jim Crow laws. Now, these differences are going to carry over into the 20th century. There are going to be some things that blend these regions a little bit more together. So the creation of, for example, of a mass media and natural like the radio, and like we'll start to kind of like bring these regions together more nationally. So will nationalistic movements in the 20th century, like, for example, national calls for imperialism, nationalism that revolves around World War I, and then of course also nationalism that revolves around World War II. So those things are going to bring our country together, but these regional divisions are still going to remain. If you know these regional differences, then you can answer a ton of questions. All right, this regionalism that I've been talking about, I'm going to go there. It is. This regionalism that I'm going to talk about helps you understand a number of different things that you need to know for the AP test. Not only does it help you understand like the differences in political parties, why different political groups supported what, but it also helps us understand the buildup to the Civil War, differences in views on westward expansion, and then in the post-Civil War, some of the conflicts that emerged politically on the western frontier, the idea of like farmers versus business, and so on. Okay, so that is our content. I know that was a lot of talking on my part, but I cannot stress enough how important these concepts are, because you might get a question where they ask you to compare different regions. You could get a comparison in DBQ. And a very easy way that they could compare it would be by like these regional cultural differences or these economic differences. You might also get a question on, say, like I said, political parties or the buildup to the Civil War. And so this covers a lot of different things, and you need to know that. Okay, so kind of keep those things in mind.